hopefully we've put together a presentation that won't put you to sleep and hopefully gives you a good roadmap on how you could do this with whatever direction you want to go. Is kind of the goal with it. Going a little slow here just to make sure that we don't get too far ahead of us. But we'll start with the introductions. I'm Peter Jurhs, the Executive Director of Network Infrastructure and Endpoint Services here.
Patrick Carlton with CompuNet, Principal Engineer.
And Patrick's along for the ride with me because he's a great resource for us here in the Boise area and was really instrumental in helping us understand some of the things that you have to think about on this road to transitioning your phone system and sort of modernizing it and looking at those. Well, this slide is really kind of here talking about where you start. You have to know what you got before you know where you begin planning where you were. So kind of real quick rundown on where Boise State was is when I started this process, we had our traditional Cisco on-premise call manager. We had implemented WebEx as a soft phone client, and we had the all the pieces that required to do that and make it work on and off campus to do that. And it really wasn't the experience that we're looking for, and that's kind of what drove our looking at it and doing that. So a combination of the phone system and the model that we're using at the university to fund it at the time was driving a exodus from that. It was a chargeback model, and we were charging for phones. That chargeback was the way the network team was funded. So we were running an enterprise network and staffing it off of the cost of a phone system. The university realized that was sort of flawed. We've now switched this fiscal year and is now centrally funded, and that's kind of the big change there for that. But when we look at current state, you have to think about what does it do well, what is that? And Patrick, what else do you think of when you think about a current state of a phone system, so you can figure out where you need to go?
Right. So, yeah, I mean, specifically, BSU is on Cisco Call Manager, which relies on ESXi. So that's another challenge that's kind of come into play the last year with Broadcom, I think, or is it Broadcast? I always get those two confused. Anyways, once they got bought out, and now ESXi licensing has really become expensive if you want to stay current. And then also just keeping everything up to date is a challenge, right, with your on-premise system. Keeping those servers up to date, routers. So there's just a lot of infrastructure that goes into an on-premise system. So looking at how you can potentially reduce some of that complexity is where something like a Zoom really comes in, I think.
And the current state, I would also add that you have to think about what things are on there. So you've got a lot of things that are on your phone system, meaning elevators, code blue phones, faxes. So then the next thing I jumped into in trying to make the presentation engaging, I tried to think about the future, and I asked AI to create me a picture of a hoverboard, and that was then copyrighted. So it wouldn't create that. I tried to get it to create me a skateboard deck without trucks on it. It would never leave the wheels off and any of that stuff. I could never get it to give me a skateboard without the trucks and wheels on it. So I finally gave up and just said the presentation will be fine with it. But it did end up giving me a floating skateboard with a guy on there that sort of looks like Marty McFly. That's my fun little AI, like trying to push the boundary weirdness. But you have to think about what is the thing, where do you want to go with your phone system? And that was really kind of what I drove and looked at the function of where are we today and why are people leaving? And it really was that the real traditional phone system wasn't meeting the modern staff's needs and desires. That's really what it came down to. In looking at that and trying to get some analysis around it, there were things like if they had the soft phone client, they didn't like the way it worked. If they had a desk phone, they just weren't using it enough because they're in Zoom all day doing Zoom meetings. They didn't, actually make a phone call anymore. There were things that were changed in habits that weren't accounted for in how the phone system was currently working or what it was doing. And we needed to look at how do we account for those and how do we bring features that will bring people back in to the system. And the one that came along and really kind of helped drive the discussion was actually bringing SMS to our phone system and bringing that so people get text messages. It's actually pretty timely with a few other things going on there because we're able to look at using Zoom and the Zoom phone features for SMS for multi-factor authentication on a number that we control. We can set on what we call mail drop accounts, some generic accounts that are tied for that. But we can actually get multi-factor going on those in a way that we can manage from beginning to end. So it looks like there's actual additional synergy that I didn't plan for in addition to when I was thinking about this originally in some of those questions that came along with it. And Patrick mentioned one of the other future states that I consider one of those happy little instances that occurred with our ability to then decommission the Cisco stuff on VMware, that we were able to not renew our VMware licensing for this year. And we will, as of when the phone system officially gets decommissioned in the month of June, so in just a little bit, there will be no more VMware on Boise State's campus. We'll have completely moved. The phone system is the last thing there. And it would have been extremely tough to move anything else because there was no other place to put it. It wasn't supported to do that. You can't have something that's kind of life safety adjacent or truly life safety on something that's not truly supported. So that's a happy little happenstance that came out of that. But you have to think about where that goes and how that works and where do you want to be for stuff. And then, there's always the debate is, do you deploy desk phones or do you deploy soft phones? And this comes down to, how does your organization want to do and what does your organization want to fund? And with our change in budget model that we went to for the phone system here, we said the base level of service or the thing that everybody gets no matter what is a soft phone. If Patrick had a desk here on campus and he was an employee and he says, I really want to have a desk phone, he can buy the desk phone and we'll be glad to support it. But he has to buy the phone outright. And then when it either fails or it goes end of life and doesn't get the software patches to be secure on the network, any of those things, Patrick and his department would be on the hook to replace it. That's the model that we went with. But there's a lot of other reasons to think about what desk phone you pick and why. And Patrick, what else? Why would people pick one over the other or both?
Well, I mean, if you have environments where you have maybe shared areas where it's like multiple people are going to be answering the phone they don't actually have a user account, that's where I think physical phones make the most sense. Or if you have maybe, an old school receptionist where they just don't want to learn something new. Having a phone with a sidecar, that's helpful. But realistically, I think most people would rather just use a soft phone. But then it comes into play where you need to make sure you're providing a good headset so that people have a good experience. So that's another thing just to account for as you do that. But in my experience with working with a lot of different customers that have moved to the cloud, you don't need to buy everyone a hard phone. And what a lot of companies have done is they'll just buy a small amount and then by default, like you're doing, is not giving them a hard phone, but then deploying the hard phone when they ask for it. And you'll find that you probably need a lot less hard phones than you actually would think you might need initially. So,
yeah, our experience is that there were a handful of departments, really 2 or 3, that said, yeah, quite a few of our people need desk phones, and they went ahead and paid for them. But we were able to pick a much more cost-effective model. A Polyphone is where we landed over the Cisco 8841, which came through at like $330. $97 sounds a lot better. You had a question, Brian?
The departments who picked handphones, do they have more people on campus versus people that didn't necessarily want the handset?
That is a great question. The ones that were, I'm thinking through, the housing was the biggest one. That was the biggest single order. And it was just kind of way their business practice. People were kind of used to having phones on their desks for that one. And that was more of a business choice. It wasn't that they were more hybrid or remote because, the housing folks are here on campus because the students are here on campus. Past that, the departments, the rest of them were, most of them were here, definitely here on campus because that's where we deployed the phones. And it came down to preference. It was, I don't want to sound bad, but it generally did relate to age, and it did relate to their comfort with the just a change in technology. There was more comfortable for some people on campus, and I knew that going in, which is why we had to offer it. But that was the kind of the combination of stuff. Anybody that was hybrid, obviously they did that, and they took the soft phone option. We didn't ship anything out to do that, although we could have, because moving to the cloud does allow you to have those remote phones where it would have been difficult with that on-premise system to truly support those, make those work reliably. So this is kind of the big thing where we spent a lot of time thinking of this, and this is one where you probably have already thought about this, but we had to rethink about this when we did our move to the cloud. What does it look like? Carrier's law is pretty straightforward. If somebody dials 911, it needs to go through. They don't need to have an extra number on there to get that outside line. But the Ray-Baum Act is about E911 location and getting location to information. And that's the one where you really have to know kind of what's going on and how you're attacked on that. In my research, we talked to quite a few universities and others doing this work, and they were investing lots of time and effort into mapping every wired network port on campus so they could guarantee they knew where that location was. That is not the tack that I took. I realized that we knew pretty well where we deployed stuff, and we had a pretty good process already for when you move offices, you're supposed to tell us, keyword is supposed to, tell us that when you move offices so we can get that location updated, and that existing process covers all those wired devices. So we left that in place and that practice there, and we were able to then, anybody that was wireless with my device that has a soft phone on there, we knew where all the wireless access points are. There's 2 in this room, so we know I'm most likely connected to one of those 2. So it knows that I'm on the 2nd floor of the sub seamlessly. I never have to enter if I'm on the wireless network. It never prompts me for my location, and it's always accurate based off where my device connects. And that was able to import that. It does create some overhead with when you go through and change your wireless access points, because you have to then redo that list because the MAC addresses change. And it's all tied off of MAC addresses and that stuff. At least for our network, maybe your design, you'd be able to do it off of IP ranges or other stuff. That wasn't a good fit for us for various reasons. But those are things to think about. And the other one is I actually answer most of my calls on my cell phone. But if I called 911 on Zoom on my cell phone, it actually routes it over my carrier. And then it becomes my carrier's responsibility. So Zoom on my phone is always the cellular provider's E911 location duty. So that's how that one's handled. So that again mitigated most of the risk. And then the last one is Zoom prompts you to update your location if it doesn't know it. So if you're on a wireless network. So I go to the coffee shop that's down over the road across the way because I want to get off campus. It prompts me. I can give it the location. I can say I'm on Lusk Street getting my coffee at Dawson Taylor and give it the address. And then it knows. And then, if I did call 911 on my device, I would never go to my computer to call 911 while I'm at the coffee shop. But it has the accurate location. I did it for my home. And the one that surprised me was I had a device and I had registered it, and then I took my a test poly Polycom phone home that was wireless and got it on my wireless network at home just to see if it would work and tinker with it. And it didn't prompt me or give me any warnings about E91 location because Zoom already knew the MAC address of my wireless access points at home. And so when it saw that phone on there, it had a location that went with it tied to it just knew where it was. And we were able to check in the back end because I'm like talking to the team. Why didn't it prompt me? Shouldn't it have been angry about this? And the answer is because I've already put it in there. Zoom already knew about it and was able to use that information and get it accurately. So while compliance is important, it isn't a scary reason not to move forward for stuff. Is maybe my biggest statement there.
Yeah, I would say it even improves compliance because I do a lot of work with on-premise phone systems as well. And then when you have people that take phones off of the network, we use something called mobile and remote access for Cisco. And there's no native solution to actually track those phones. You'd have to manually put those MAC addresses in. Nobody's doing that. Or you'd have to have a third-party solution. So to be compliant with Ray Baum's and Kerry's law is very difficult with the on-premise systems because they weren't designed for that. But all of the cloud phone systems were actually designed to make it work. And they have all the tools you need to make it work built in. So it's pretty cool, I think.
And this is the other one that you have to think about is how are you going to solve the problem? Because you have a mess of analog lines somewhere on campus doing something, and they may or may not be centralized for stuff. And for me, my line that I really there is the 80s are calling and want their technology back. It is true because the technology, a lot of people feel like faxing is super secure and safe and it's awesome, but it's over the same old plain old switch telephone network that the FBI in 2024 said is not safe for you to send text messages over, but it's safe for me to send my HIPAA faxes over. Okay, I'm going to get off my soapbox, but that's essentially the idea there with that one is the technology is not up to the demands of today. So we pushed everybody we could, and it was everybody but a couple fax machines in our health services department to an online fax provider. Now that doesn't mean that the faxes they receive still go over the plain old switch network. They still have those issues, but they receive them, and we've set up everything secure. We can meet all the security requirements for sending and receiving faxes with the eFax thing, and it's meets the requirements, and it really does hit that 95% rule. We stopped with the one health services organization that does have to have HIPAA compliance because we didn't have the BAA in place. So that's one to eventually get to for that one. But that was the stopping point. It was a legal agreement, not the fact that the technology wasn't up to snuff there. But those are things you have to plan for, and we did that. So we ported our numbers to the fax provider. So then they were doing that because previously our workaround was to forward a 426 number to the fax provider's provided number. So somebody would call, 208-426 fax me, whatever it is, and they would get directed over to the online fax provider already because we'd already tried to get rid of as many of these as we could. This just continued the push, and then we just ported the numbers that were getting used over for those accounts for that. And then you have a lot of other plain old telephone system lines out there for fire alarms, elevators. Our few big ones are elevators, area of refuge, and the code blue phones on campus. So if you did the tour yesterday, you walked around campus, you probably saw those, the blue towers where you could mash a button and get some help, or mash one of the two buttons because they're a 2-button model. And those are all, most of those, in fact, all of those are analog for various reasons. Most of them is because they're far away from any other network closet for that in a lot of cases. So the result is you have to know how you're going to deal with those. We've kept all the analog. We did move it to Zoom. We did go with audio codes, analog devices, and we were lucky here on Boise State because we could buy high density ones and put them in one location for most of our spot, because all of it for our legacy, we have thousands of analog lines that landed in one spot that we call our heat plant here on campus. And the 300 or so there still have plenty of analog connectivity to get back to that. Anything new, we say you have to at least get to a building that connects to that building so we can cross connect to get you through for that. So we can control that with any new construction. We can keep that there. With that means those analog gateways are in a battery backed up generated facility. We don't have to worry about that stuff. We did do a little investigation for a couple of buildings that are not on the that network and don't have that access, and we found out Idaho building code is 4 hours to keep your elevator line up and working if there's a power outage. So that was our research. 4 hours is what it is. So you'd have to check Nevada's. I'm assuming it's probably the same because there's an international building code. Most of them just follow that. But that's what we did is in those separate buildings that we could control, where we had an elevator and we had to do that. We put in an audio audio codes device and enough battery to keep it up for 4 hours. But Patrick, you want to talk about some of the other analog solutions that are out there?
So the audio codes that Peter did, that was the solution that they chose. But we also investigated POTS lines replacements. I don't know if you guys have ever looked into that, but it's essentially a device that can register over the network, over the internet, and then you get POTS lines, and then a lot of times they'll have battery backup and then also a cellular backup. So I think the reason you probably went with the solution you had is you could do it a little less expensive on a monthly reoccurring cost, whereas if you go with the POTS line replacement, there might be a little higher cost, but then you don't have to manage the equipment. So that was one of the advantages there. And I think the other thing to talk about, and probably in the higher ed, you probably don't have a lot of analog paging, but that is something else to consider if you're moving away from a premise system, is how are you going to handle that? And there are a lot of SIP gateways and things like that that could potentially replace the analog you're doing today, and have that type of thing either registering directly to a cloud provider like Zoom or wherever you're, I guess sending out your audio pages if that's something that you have to do in your environment.
So once you've kind of got through all that, you know what you're doing, you know where you're going, you know how you've solved all these problems, then you need to kind of plan how you're going to do it. For us, we started with our migration was to Zoom Phone, and we started with Zoom Professional Services, and they helped us through. We actually started with a number of the first 400 lines for that in our migration, and that was enough to get us going. And since November, essentially, we've been doing it all internally, all one person migrating our, essentially. It'd be about 3,000 lines total, and so over the months, and it's just been one person's job to plan and go through and do that. And yes, he is happy to be coming towards the end, but it has not been overwhelming. It's been something he's been able to do, and he's been very successful at it and gotten very good at it. Our advantage happened a little bit is our current SIP provider, Syringa, and Zoom use the same back-end provider behind the scenes. So they, rolls up the stack. So that actually helped with the porting process. It made a few of the obstacles, reduced some of the amount of lead time that we had to have. So if your mileage may vary on your port and planning, but I think professional services who does this day and day will be able to help you with that. And do that. So whatever solution you do have, most likely that company will have some professional services or a partner that does this stuff quite a bit that can help with the porting. We selected to do it department by department and manage it that way, and do a whole bunch of departments every month, totaling about 250 to 400 depending on the month. And that's worked really well for us because we could do a whole department there. And we did that because a department may be in multiple buildings. OIT is a really good example. I think we're still in 8 or 10 buildings around campus. So doing a building may not get everybody in that department. and various other reasons for that. The logistics for that. Your planning may vary because you may have different circumstances, but that was kind of our approach. And I really do think that you have to figure out. You do that. There was one thought at some point when we got really close to the end of our VMware licensing, do we go ahead and accelerate our schedule and do that to just line up with that? Or do we live for what are the months of April and May, essentially without VMware licensing, running on a VMware stack that if something goes kaboosh, we couldn't bring back? For there. And we decided the risk because the number of phones continue to get less and less. We were real close to the end. The risk versus the cost, one of those kinds of analysis there happened. But that's really for our plan. But it definitely would have been possible when we looked at this and really got serious about, is that really going to happen in April or the end of May or end of March when the licensing was expired? We're making that decision in December and January. We had the opportunity that if we really felt like we had to, we could accelerate. And I felt like we could have done it without much issue. And for us, most of this is hands off. We can roll out most of the stuff without a lot of time here. It really only the extra time that we need somebody to come hands on is on the days that we port phones. And most of that is around either going around and checking on departments and getting somebody there to say, hey, have you logged into Zoom? Most of the time, that's the single biggest challenge is, did you log into your Zoom client so you can actually get your phone calls now instead of your WebEx client if they were using a soft phone? So that's been one challenge is they're like, well, I just thought it'd start ringing. I'm like, okay. And then the other one is the desk phones, because we did roll out some common area phones, some of those for those locations that aren't tied to people, and getting people to go collect phones and make sure the new ones are plugged in. And that's where folks like Harrison in the back who's here to help run our AV, and the team of desktop support staff has helped the network team do that on those Thursdays, a couple of them. And so between the 3 or 4 people, we've been able to cover the campus and get to everything quickly enough and do all of that stuff. It hasn't been a huge resource burden for us to accomplish that. That I think really does have to do with we planned it pretty well and we have a good schedule. We've told people we've done pretty good communication, and that has helped a lot. And we picked a platform that people are happy with, and it's not like a fight. That's a win for us too. What have you found in other organizations migrating?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different ways to tackle that, and porting numbers is definitely one of the challenges, right? Some customers actually do like local gateway configuration, so you can actually configure your on-premise system to talk to the cloud, right? And then so during your migration process, you can have interoperability between the two systems. But then that kind of generally will lengthen your deployment process because you're just going at a slower pace. And then you might have certain things that maybe don't work exactly the way you want it to. So that could be a challenge. So getting from one platform to the next, I think is the best path. And then zero-touch provisioning is also a really nice feature that a lot of these cloud providers have. So all you have to do is know the MAC address of your device. You put it in the system, and it actually reaches out to like a provisioning server, and then it says, oh, this is a Zoom phone. It sends it to Zoom, and it registers to Zoom. So having that capability, so you don't have to pull things out of the boxes. You don't have to plug them into the network, configure them. You just have to know what the MAC address is, program it ahead of time, and it really just makes it just simplifies the deployment, I think.
So a couple things here. We kind of jumped into the slide already, but in doing this, our experience is Zoom had a pretty rigid porting schedule. They do all their ports at 11:30 Eastern Monday through Friday. And they actually recommend not doing them on Friday because if something goes wrong with the port, you don't have enough time to fix it before people disappear. So we've actually picked either a Tuesday or Thursday for most of our ports, and it's gone really well. if you were on a call and a call came in at 9:25 and it came in via the old system and you're on your Cisco or WebEx, that call continues. The port happens, and your next phone call that rings on your number would come in via Zoom. Really seamless. I mean, it's like a 15-minute window where there's a little weirdness going on, but after that, it's doing that. And if there was somebody on a call, their call didn't drop because it was already established with that one. So that was it's worked pretty well, and it hasn't been something where we've had to have people work on the weekends or do that stuff or do any of those things. And I think that's probably the idea to charge forward with, and we've done it for all of the high profile folks on campus. So the biggest one I think that had the most concern was our financial aid department, and we did them 9:30 on a Thursday morning, or maybe it was a Tuesday, but it doesn't really matter, that they migrated over and their new system started working, and then they stopped taking calls in their old system, and we had a plan to migrate them through, and it worked really well. So even the high touch ones that had some concerns and were concerned with that, we've been able to talk them through it and make it work pretty well for them. So that's probably the piece that you have to learn, is you're going to have to coach people, hold their hands, listen to them, but it's all doable. So we've kind of hinted at Boise State's path that we've moved to Zoom Phone, but I do want to say that I went through a lot of work to get us there. I spent a year ahead of getting approval to go with it, testing both Zoom Phone and WebEx, and talking through why we would do those, and put a report together for OIT leadership and recommended that. And there's kind of a couple really key things that came out of that. Is WebEx had a bad name. We didn't want to leave Zoom meetings, and Zoom had a really positive experience on campus. So even though the Cisco to WebEx migration was significantly easier for the team to do, the campus community really wanted, we concluded, was going to be much more well served with the Zoom solution for that one. And there's lots of other providers out there that we could have done, but I didn't want to have to go through and negotiate a new contract, do that stuff. I had existing MSAs and agreements with either of those partners, so those were the easy buttons for me to charge forward with, without having to go through a long, lengthy procurement process in addition to that. So I had some selfish reasons for that on the download, but the reality is the positive experience with Zoom, and everybody that has moved or gotten a Zoom phone and was worried about it has really appreciated how well it works for that one. So and we've talked about it. We've moved all our analog. We actually moved all our analog in the month of August of 2024. It was the start of school. We knew we couldn't move any departments there. That was a little too aggressive. But I knew I could move all the elevators and all the analog, and we did all that in that month with stuff that no one would notice. No one cares if the phone number changes for an elevator because no one knows what it is. And if they did figure it out, all they were doing was calling it so they could talk to somebody and annoy them while they're riding the elevator. So those are things that we were able to do. So we looked at when those downtimes were and took advantage of them to use that as getting that done. So we moved OIT in July, all the elevators and analog in August, and then departments every month throughout there. We've got a schedule that's published on our website if you're really bored and want to go look at it. And we've already talked about some of the user benefits. Right now, I've got SMS with my 426 number. You can text me. You can do that. We've significantly improved what we consider the self-service experience. There's a lot more that you can do and configure. While there was quite a bit in Cisco, but you had to know the way, the method, I'm one of the few people that would know how to call into the voicemail, to set your out of office rule, to set a beginning and end date when you did that, and do that all via the IVR for the Cisco phones. People didn't do it. Or the alternative is they didn't know how to change holiday hours for the phone queues. All of those things that were call tickets to us are all now self-service for every phone queue administrator that's been delegated on campus. So the help desk manager knows that he can set the holiday hours when they're going to be out of office, or if they have to close for an emergency or something, and they could set hours and do that without having to call us. So there's a lot of things that drove self-service for us that really did do that. And I think really the last one is probably what put the nail in the WebEx coffin for us, is the way we set it up with the on-premise connection for WebEx. As soon as you changed network contexts, the call would drop, because you completely changed IP addresses for stuff, and the way it was, so the system would drop your call. So if I was on Wi-Fi and I walked outside where Wi-Fi dropped, that call would drop. Or if I was on my cellular and I walked past a building and the Wi-Fi connected, the call would drop. Or any of those things. There's a myriad of reasons why on WebEx you had a kind of a poor experience with that, and that mobility experience. Where on Zoom, yes, it may get a little funky if you're walking through campus and it connects to cellular, connects to Wi-Fi, and back and forth, but the call doesn't drop. As long as you stop and you let it settle for a second, the call will reconnect. It does work. And I catch myself, all of a sudden it starts getting, I'm like, oh, I know what's going on, because it's trying to switch too much. Because there's so much, there's so many connection options, and I switch back and forth so quickly on the device so often. So that's the kind of my one experience. So if I'm walking around campus, I typically need to remember to turn off my Wi-Fi, and then it works well. If I'm inside a building, I can walk around and you're on Wi-Fi and it'll just work. It's nice. So, yeah, for me, the first two are the big ones. The self-service features are huge, because those were all tickets that would come to my team for stuff that they would have to do and configure for folks, because those just weren't available for on the Cisco UCCX system. Any other benefits that you've come up with?
Yeah, I mean, the self-service, I'll kind of tag along on that, like, being able to set, maybe during hours I want my cell phone to ring, maybe after hours I don't. And as a user, you can go and make those changes. And on the, some of the premise systems, that's a little bit more of a challenge to maybe coach people through, and it's just works better, I think.
I'm guessing it transcribes voicemail too.
Yep. So yeah, voicemail transcriptions is definitely, that's another good feature. You can have it do that. Yeah, one of the things that would be different, though, if you're used to like CallMan or your unified communications, when you delete a voicemail out of email, it deletes it out of your inbox. There's not that synchronization between the two. So generally, having people use it through the app is better, because then you don't have to synchronize the two places, right? So that's just kind of a user training thing. But yeah, also there's a lot of AI features that are built into Zoom. So if you record phone calls, you could have it transcribed, summarized. A lot of those features are built into the meetings platform as well. But yeah, so there's a lot of things that you can kind of start taking advantage of once you go that route. But then some of that stuff has to be turned on by your administrator, so it may not be on by default, and then the policies of how you guys want to do that stuff.
And then kind of the last for us, a big one is we've been able to very much simplify the administration piece, because we moved to something in the cloud. It's there. We don't have to worry about upgrades, any of that kind of server overhead that we had to do with all of that infrastructure, because there was, I don't know, more servers than I want to count that made the phone system go. And that is kind of a huge win in just time and planning and verification and testing that we don't have to do anymore. We have reduced our analog lines because mostly around fax. We have life safety stuff that we have to keep around, but that's where it is, and we force that. We have it'll be one less thing to keep track of, and I think the big one that's coming along for us that the on-premise Cisco system didn't provide is easier integrations. So once we complete the migration, one of the things that's on my roadmap for creating is working to integrate Zoom Phone with Canvas. So then the professor can choose to send a message out via text message from Canvas to the students. We have some things to figure out with that, but that Zoom's already demoed the thing for me. I know it does it. So the question is, it'll be in our data. So we're going to have to figure out our data and make sure that we've got the right data in the right places to do that. But those are the things that come a lot easier for folks over what we've done before. If we had to try and do that with the on-premise system and make that work, that would be so much custom code and gluing. It would be probably fragile and never work right, and we would just have a black eye for even trying. Kind of thing. So those are in my world, some of the huge benefits is I look more agile and more flexible because I've picked a product that aligns with that mentality that comes along with that. And that was just kind of something that came along for the ride, in my opinion, for stuff. Well, I talked about the future. So I think we're kind of at, we're closing in on time, so we want to take the last end of this for questions. What questions do you guys have? Go for it.
So we're kind of in that pickle right now where our telecommunications team is not under IT. That may change, that may not. But when we migrated to Zoom a few years ago, I know we were really trying to get them to come on board with us and start to think about changeovers into Zoom Phone, because right now people have Zoom Workplace and they have WebEx. And then our help desk gets confused because somebody will say, I need help configuring WebEx, and the help desk will say, well, we stopped using WebEx because we changed to Zoom, and they don't realize that has nothing to do with the phone system. So one of the core arguments we got was, well, we have to upgrade all the analog phones. There's still, things that need to be upgraded with the elevators and whatnot. Can you do a phased approach with this? Like, would it be something that you could say we could migrate people who have desk phones? Because we have the 8845s, I think, on the Cisco line, which would work with Zoom Phone. At least that's what we were told. So can you do like a phased approach to this, or would it require multiple services to keep running? Or like, what would you, if you were in my shoes, what would you say to them to be like, this can work?
One, I'm more than willing to talk to them. Okay. So feel free to catch up with me. You can find my email on the website, all that stuff. I'll be glad to talk them through and talk through all of this stuff and get them with our technical folks, and they can talk through all of these things that you're seeing for challenges. I see a couple ways. The analog, while kind of scary, depends on what the solution is and how it's done. And there's some, questions I have in my mind. If it like for us, we knew that we had most of it centralized, 98% of it. So if I could solve that problem, then the rest of it came together for that. And definitely you could leave the analog alone and do it last and do that stuff. And even then, the analog all depends on how it's, what it is. So if it's an analog device, it either goes to a analog carrier, the trained, CenturyLink POTS line from whatever carrier's in your area, or it's an on-premise device providing that service that connects to the phone system anyways. So you can look at it as you could avoid those for a while and put them last. You heard what I did is I put them first because I was confident that we could get them up and get them in Zoom and provide the reliability that we need. We look at it as I have two diverse paths for the internet. One on the west of campus, one on the east of campus. So both of those would have to go down at the same time, and the heat plant would have to have a power outage that the generator didn't pick up on, and the battery didn't carry for enough time for there to be an analog outage on campus. So I feel like I've done a reasonable job at mitigating the risks. So you talk about risk management. Yes, is it flawless? But there's also a good enough, and you have to figure out where that is for stuff. And then for the rest of those, the 8841s, we had a whole bunch of those on campus, and assuming those are the Cisco Enterprise license, you have to pay to convert those to the MPP license. There it is. And we found that cost was high enough, along with the labor that we felt was included to do that it was cheaper to buy new phones for that, because we could get a Polycom phone for $97 that was appropriate to put on everybody's desks. So, and you got that what Patrick talked about, that zero touch provisioning, where you just enter it and you plop it there, you plug it in, and it works. And I could take that same phone home, plug it in on my a wired port on my router, and it would work at home too. It would work flawlessly pretty much anywhere you would take it, as long as it's got that wired connection. So I think it is definitely viable to do a phased approach and think about this. And it really does come with planning and thinking through all of the issues. I would say that it's more than accomplishable from my point of view. But I think the phased approach would be probably get the people, because I think the people are the ones that are confused. Fix those first. The analog can come later. And they can solve that one. That one can take some time. It would probably be the way I would look at the approach on that one.
And like the audio code devices that BSU used use the same Anthenol connectors that the other system was using. So once you get the router configured, you plug in the connector and you're done. So you didn't have to repatch everything. You just moved the Anthenol connector after you configured it.
Yeah, he was talking about a lot of investment in infrastructure. And I'm thinking to myself, is that all necessary for this? Because that's what I think is their big hang-up, is they want all the infrastructure to be consistent before doing it, and not have to do a phased approach. But I'm thinking if they can pull off the bulk of the audience and get it all taken care of, then figure out the rest of it at another time. You know, that meant we would have to keep two different systems in play, one Cisco system.
Yeah, we've done it until we fully migrated. I did it over one fiscal year. Was kind of and actually I narrowed that down to one school year. Really, we started in September and we're finishing in May. So it's just been one academic year for that to finish. So I think it is doable, and it does come around planning. So I think that's accomplishable. Any other questions? You're welcome. Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.